Thanks, and very nice to be in New York again. This place, reminds me a bit, not that I was ever there, but once seen so many photographs of cabaret. Cabarets in pre-war Berlin during the Weimar Republic. And I was just thinking, as I was sitting there, that it's a pity we can't have a real cabaret. Because what we could have done tonight, had we had a daily cabaret on the Weimar model, was to have a cabaret on the IMF and how it rapes African countries. Think about that one. The situation I've been asked to talk about is what is going on in the Arab world. And I think even the conservative element in Europe and the United States and elsewhere have been pretty shaken by what's happened in the Arab world, because it was totally unexpected, spontaneous, and largely, at least in two big countries, successful, though it's not over yet. And it's the success in Tunisia and Egypt of getting rid of two despots, which had been, both of whom had been backed by the West for many decades, that has changed the atmosphere and temperature in that whole world. So we have seen a spread of the movement in a way that we haven't seen in the world for a long, long time. I mean, people sometimes say 68, but that was very different. And the spread was also limited in comparison. What this reminded me of when it erupted was the wave of revolutions which shook Europe in 1848 for independence, against imperial domination, and which spread very rapidly. The only country it didn't reach in 1848 was Britain. But in the Arab world, virtually every country now is affected, even where the demonstrations and mass mobilizations have been very small, but the mood underneath is very angry. And I refer to the country where we've had tiny demonstrations which were repressed very rapidly, which is Saudi Arabia. The country which first the British and then the American Empire have kept going with this corrupt, kleptocratic monarchy, and which they will do everything in their power to preserve. And they will use force to make sure that this particular regime isn't toppled. Which is why they intervened very rapidly, used the Saudis to intervene in Bahrain, where even as we gather here today, people in Bahrain are being tortured, killed. Pogroms of Shia are taking place in that country. The Saudis came in, totally sectarianized the conflict, which it wasn't before. Young people who first came out in Bahrain said, neither Sunni nor Shia, we are Bahrainis, and we want democracy, and we want freedom. But the most important country in the Arab world, because of its size, its strategic importance, and its history, is of course Egypt. And it's very interesting that Joseph Biden, the US Vice President, when he arrived in the Middle East some weeks ago and was asked about Libya, he actually said, I'm not that interested in Libya, even though they just started bombing the country. He said, I'm not that interested in Libya. He said, let me be totally straight with you guys. We are thinking of nothing but Egypt. And why are they thinking of Egypt? Because Egypt has been a linchpin in US strategy in the region, especially in relation to Israel, and keeping control of the Palestinians. And were they to lose that, and all the indications are that there is deep ferment on this particular issue now, on the anniversary of the Nakba, must be worrying them greatly. So how are they going to pull it back together again? And here there are interesting comparisons. That in Tunisia, the mass movement pushed through and won the demand to elect a constituent assembly which will prepare a new constitution. That is what happened incidentally in many parts of South America, that the new leaders who were elected pushed referendums to get new constitutions which were infinitely more democratic than anything that had existed before. The Tunisians have now won that right, and there will be elections to a constituent assembly to produce a new democratic constitution. In Egypt, that fight has been lost temporarily, I hope, because they just passed a few amendments to the old constitution and it was voted for, largely, in my opinion, because the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a major political force in Egypt, thought that if we go in for new constitutions, who knows, we might lose the references to religion in the existing constitution, which says that the Sharia, the Islamic law, is one of the laws which apply in the country, and they were nervous that young people, especially the people who mobilized in Tahrir Square and effectively got rid of the dictator, might win support for a different sort of constitution. So they ganged up with the army and the bureaucracy and just amended the old constitution. I say all these things because it's extremely important to monitor the situation. When we win victories, when mass movements win victories, those who have been discomforted and those who feel they've got to regain control never stop working to try and regain the initiative. And so the battle for Egypt is taking place now on many, many different levels. But the memory of what they have been able to achieve is, of course, there. And it goes very deep. I mean, the Egyptians have a historical memory anyway. They remember the nationalist period in the late 50s and 60s. But now they have a new memory. And this memory is very important for them, and it's not going to go away quickly, even if they suffer setbacks. And this memory essentially says that if mass movements and people organize and mobilize and lose their fear of death, they can achieve miracles. And that is what happened in Egypt. That every time repression began, every time Mubarak's thugs killed people, thought they would intimidate them, snipers shot from above, they assumed that they would be able to push the movement back. The effect was totally the opposite. That every time they did this, the next day or the next weekend, even more people came out. And not just in Cairo. The images we saw were largely of Cairo, in Tahrir Square. But the city around which there is it's a city encircled by industry, factories, the old historic city of Alexandria. Here you had an insurrection which for 3 whole days took the city. And the police, the repressive forces were driven out of the city. The only people who could take it back were the army, and they did it, saying, we are with you. We've just, we're not going to kill or anything, but do let us just restore some order. And they did. And I remember when I was watching that and talking to Egyptian friends, I thought that had there been in Alexandria a social movement or a political group or whatever, with even 300 or 400 people, and it had suggested that they elect an Alexandrian government, local government, with which the army or anyone who wanted to come in would negotiate, and create in Alexandria, however temporarily, a model state, or what they wanted the whole of Egypt to be. The effect of that would have been electric. That didn't happen. But what happened was enough to show people that they could make their own history. And that is something we haven't seen for a very long time, 40, 50 years in world history, in politics, in most parts of the world. We saw elements of it in South America, in Bolivia, in Venezuela, in Ecuador, but the mass mobilizations, which in Venezuela were huge, were not on this scale, just because Egypt itself is a huge country. I mean, to have on one single day, at a crucial moment, 7 million people out on the streets, it is that scale and that level of mobilization which overthrows and topples governments. Despots and crowned heads fall when the mobilization reaches that stage. And the critical moment came, of course, when the army was sent into Tahrir Square. What would it do? And there was nervousness initially, and then the demonstrators spontaneously hugged the soldiers, hugged the officers, hugged the tanks, climbed on the tanks, fraternized. And at that moment, it was obvious that these soldiers, or the ones who had been sent in, were not going to open fire. And that was a pretty classic revolutionary moment in the evolution of Egypt. And that is, in reality, the moment when the State Department here realized that it was going to be very awkward and difficult to keep Mubarak in power. They tried. I mean, if you want to go through what they did, Hillary Clinton's press conference or press interview, in which she said Mubarak is a close friend and ally of the United States. Why? Bill and I regard him as family. Which is true. He gave them lots of freebies and holidays on the Sharm el-Sheikh, as he did Tony Blair and his family. No doubt lots of heads of states regarded him as family. Then the time came to send a special envoy to speak to him. Who did they pick? They picked the former US ambassador to Egypt, who now worked for a big public relations company, and this public relations company had the official government contract from Egypt to act on its behalf. And this guy did most of the acting. And he is sent by the White House and the State Department as the official US representative to talk to Mubarak. And he arrives in Egypt and sees Mubarak and gives a press conference, and when the press say, "What did you tell Mubarak?" he says, "I told Mubarak to hang on in there." He was recalled, obviously, because whether he'd exceeded his brief, we don't know. But I think when they realized in Washington that there was no way the army could be used, because the risk of a split in the army was too great, that is when Mubarak's goose was cooked. He had to leave. But what did he try? This has not been published, what I'm going to tell you now. I mean, I'm going to write about it. I want some more confirmation. But I have heard from Egyptians very close to the military high command that Mubarak rang up the Israelis and said to them, "Can't you create a diversion on the border so I can send the army to deal with you and we'll crush the movement?"